Marhaba. Thank you very much for having me with you this morning or this afternoon. What I wanted to do, just to pick up on the themes that we've heard this morning from Cedar, from Serkan, from Steve, is just think a little bit about these trends that are shaping the world, or rather reshaping the world. And what we've tried to do at Ipsos over the last year is to put them in a single place, which we're going to see now. I hope it's useful for you. A couple of things before I start. The first is, when we're looking back, these trends all seem relatively clear. Steve talked about how Istanbul had changed over time. But when we're looking to the future, it's more difficult. Because a lot of these changes happen day by day, month by month, year by year even, and it's only after a while you might say, oh, were we prepared for that? So perhaps that's one of my opening questions, is for our organisations that we work for, all of them, are they prepared for these trends and how they're going to influence their markets or their business or the things that they need to do? And the second point is about us, and perhaps a more personal point. How do we feel about it? Certainly putting together this presentation, there's times when I'm getting quite excited about the new changes that are coming and what's happened to our world, and there's times when perhaps one gets a bit more worried. So perhaps also as people, how do we feel about some of these trends? So let's go. First change that we're seeing are what we might call dynamic populations. The global population continues to grow. Between now and 2050, we're going to add the populations of India and China to our planet. These are big changes that happening to us over the coming years, powered by increasing birth rates in many places, but not in others. And you'll see in Europe, for example, we have population decline. We have the opposite in many other countries. Are we prepared? Two case studies. The US, its population is continuing to grow quite considerably, certainly much more than Germany or Japan. But look at Nigeria. We're going to see a point in about 25 years from now when the population of Nigeria will be more than that of the United States. Again, are we prepared? Are we thinking about the Nigerian market or the African market, and are we making the preparations now that will enable us to take advantage of that? The population is getting older at the same time. Have a look, for example, at Asia and Latin America. The median age there at the moment, 29 and 27. In the not too distant future, it's going to be over 40. In China, 1950, life expectancy, 40 years. 2050, 80 years. It's another life. It means I'm 7 years old and I can start to enjoy my second life, because perhaps if I do well, I can also have that increased life expectancy. A reminder of perhaps some of the good things that we are now able to enjoy, but we'll come on perhaps to some of the questions as well. With all of these changes comes opportunity, but also inequality. Inequality across countries is actually going down a little bit, but within countries there's actually rising inequality in many places. We are seeing a growing middle-class population that's becoming stronger and stronger, more money to spend, more things it can buy, more iPhones, as we've just seen in the last presentation. It's really, really growing, and it's going to be a majority of the population. By 2030, 66% of the world's middle classes will be living in Asia. That's not something we should be surprised about, because already there are more people living inside that circle than outside of it. Some companies, some organisations perhaps haven't been prepared for what we can see today. There are reasons to be optimistic in some countries. Look at young people. In many countries, including Turkey, people are optimistic about the future. Young people are optimistic about the future. In others, France, Belgium, Spain, less so. But certainly in many parts of the world, people are looking forward to the opportunities that life brings. And there are some things that we can really celebrate. Literacy rates across the world have increased considerably over time. And it's really, really key. As we all know, education it provides so many opportunities for us in our lives. That is real progress. It's real progress also when we think about how the economies are changing, because some analysts have found that Once you get to about 50% of the population using the internet, the World Wide Web will start to have a real impact on economic development. And at the moment, 60%, approaching 60% of the population have no internet access. So although the populations in many countries are online, remember, in many they're not. Are we organised at this stage and for tomorrow to the many, many people who are not yet online? China and India are the largest countries online, but they're also the largest countries offline. And sometimes, and I say this as a market researcher, we forget the people who aren't online, and we have to make sure that we adapt our services to those people as well as those who are. Inequality, as I mentioned, it's growing in many, many countries, and it really worries us. Unless you're in America, less so. Up in China, for example, and indeed in Turkey, people are really, really concerned about the impact of having large differences in income and wealth, and what it means for our societies. And what does it mean in our cities? Well, again, over time, more and more of us are moving to the towns and to the cities. It's not just Istanbul, it's middle-sized towns, medium-sized cities, big cities around the world. Every day, every month, and every year, 18 million people added to the world's urban population every year. Again, are we prepared? Africa, for example, is gradually going to replace Asia as the region with the highest urban growth rate. We've already got 3 cities, Lagos and Cairo now, perhaps rival a city like Istanbul in terms of their size, and more to come. And with that comes questions as well. And perhaps the personal question. Talking with many of you, you remind me about how long it takes to get around a city like Istanbul. We're finding that India and China are the only countries we found where people actually want to live in cities. For many of us, it's somewhere we have to live. And that place that we have to live has evolved when we look at the world over time. Those were the big cities in 1975. They've changed. Mumbai, Delhi, Shanghai, Jakarta, Dhaka. Depending on how you measure Istanbul, I think it can also be on that list of mega cities. So big changes that we've seen in the world in terms of the economic motors that are going to be driving where things go next. I mentioned the internet, and of course we are increasingly connected. Think about what we had to communicate, those of you in marketing, in particular advertising, in the 1980s. Radio, TV, press, some direct marketing perhaps. Now we have all of these different things that you can do all at once. They all could, if you're organised, interconnect. You could also waste a lot of money if you make the wrong kinds of choices. So there is that connectedness brings with it huge opportunities for us as citizens, but for us as businesses, as organisations, how do we best spend our money? Again, remembering that many people don't have internet access. They'd like it. It should be a basic human right, according to the people who are already online, but we don't already have it in every part of the world, as we've just seen. We say we're worried about data privacy, but then we get back onto our phones again and carry on. Big questions. Is it affecting cognition? Is it affecting our brains? In China, 78% say they're constantly looking at screens these days. Chinese under 30s, 79% feel restless or uneasy if they haven't looked at their phones for an hour, and I haven't been on my phone for half an hour. And this is how many of us are living our lives these days, and again, it's something when we're communicating, when you look at some of the things that we can now do in terms of understanding consumers and how they react to things, we have to adapt to that kind of experience. We're healthier, but we're also sicker, in some ways anyway, and I'll share with you some of the things that we've pulled together there. Life expectancy, of course, is increasing. By the turn of the century, it's going to be 83 years old across the world, not just in China. But there is a lot of work to do. There has been progress. If you look at drinking water, for example, we now have 91% of the world's population have access to improved drinking water, and there have been progress in the last 15, 16 years of this century. We still, however, have a significant number of children, of course, dying from not having access to drinking water, but there is progress. There has been less progress, however, by the world in sanitation facilities. At the turn of the century, the target was that 1 in 4, still 1 in 4 people in this world wouldn't have access to adequate sanitation, or I should say 75% would. That target has been missed. We have 1 in 3 people who do not have access to adequate sanitation. That is 700 million people that have been missed. So even as we talk all around how the world is changing, there are still the people who have been left behind, who have yet to experience perhaps what many of us would see as absolutely the basic things that everybody should have. Question number 1 about becoming healthier. Can our healthcare systems cope? Not everybody is sure, and some countries in particular are really not sure their healthcare systems are going to be able to cope with getting older and with new and more complex diseases. Uncertainty number 2, and it was something I learned in the last week, nutrition transition, which is code for us eating too much meat and too many fatty things compared with what we used to do. Most of the world's population now lives in countries where being overweight or obese kills more people than being underweight. In Turkey, perhaps to pick up on the questionnaire you've been asking yourselves, if I may be an honorary Turk for a day, we think 32% of our fellow compatriots are overweight or obese. But it's actually rather more than that. Are we prepared? Is our health service prepared? Or are we as people prepared perhaps to think about what we're eating and what we're doing in our daily lives? Third area of uncertainty is around actually the health of our planet, about climate change. It's taken some time in our surveys. I think we would say the public perhaps have been late adopters, but gradually people are agreeing with the evidence that the Earth is getting warmer. We agree that we're heading for a disaster if we don't change our habits pretty quickly. And 81% of people in Turkey feel that. But are we ready? Are we making the right choices? We'll come on to some of the things that companies are doing just at the end, but there remains that big question about what are we going to do to accommodate those extra 2.4 billion people by the year 2050. We've also got, and this is something where you absolutely can get optimistic, the choice that we have, that those people had. They may be crazy, but they stayed out all night for their new iPhones. The opportunities that we now have in our lives, but also perhaps some of the changes, the fracturing of what you might call the mass market that we've been very used to. And I'll pick up on some of the things Steve talked about in a moment. As Steve mentioned, I think Apple was number 3 in his most influential brands league table. Nowhere 40 years ago. Companies are having to adapt and to change and bring themselves into the minds of their consumers, and they are not always American companies, as we have seen from Steve's presentation. So many of them now are based in a whole range of different markets around the world, and as Steve also mentioned, many opportunities for perhaps local brands or big regional brands to break onto what you might call the world stage. And that world stage is changing. What we're used to is changing, and it may not always feel so comfortable for us. Let's take one example, motoring. Driverless cars are coming, and we know this is coming. We know that investment is going in. No one can see them out there in the streets at the moment. What's it going to do? Could be disastrous for one industry, says this press report. That industry is car insurance, because the driverless cars, it is proposed, will be safer than cars with drivers, and that will not be good for the insurance industry. Are they prepared? It may shrink America's income gap, so the opportunities perhaps there as they start to come on stream. And it may make our life a little bit less interesting. The slow, sad death of joyous motoring with our sat-navs, with our driverless cars, perhaps some things that we used to enjoy, we won't do in the same way anymore. The connected car is coming. Now, if you, like me, struggle to connect your phone to your car, you may be pleased to know that the connected car is coming, properly organized, using all of the mobile devices and all the technology devices that are now available in a nice, organized fashion in your car. And that will bring us some changes. This is the boot of an Audi A3. Now, motoring organisations, of course, often it's always been around the technology within the car. Now, people like Audi are having to make partnerships with new providers. They've got a partnership in place with DHL and Amazon. Why? Well, to give ourselves the opportunity to receive our shopping in the boot of our Audi. What could be better than that? Or what could be worse? Who knows? But this is coming. Are we prepared? The car companies are certainly having to really look at this and engage with a whole new supply chain. And that's quite transformational for them. A second thing that is changing are business presentations. Some of the still loving PowerPoint, as you can see, and we enjoy PowerPoint. Certainly I do in my work. But, and Steve touched on this earlier, we do have new players, new famous players arriving in our lives, and certainly on the business stage. So this slide is seen in business presentations around the world now. It includes Uber, it includes Alibaba, Instagram, Facebook, Airbnb, Netflix. They've got no vehicles for Uber, no real estate for Airbnb, sorry, no content for Facebook. But these are successful organisations. None of them here 20 years ago. But I think the question for perhaps other organisations we maybe work for is what can they take from some of these experiences? It's not that we necessarily need to change and copy them, but how do we adapt them? And so to come back to Sidar's point about the library, market research companies will be thinking about how they can make the most of all the different content and knowledge and experiences that they have, and how can we do more with the learning that is already there. But big changes on that score as well. The rise of the individual. Again, this can be a good thing, individual choice, individual opportunities, but what does it mean for society? Traditional family structures are changing in many countries around the world. Few of us are getting married, for example, and certainly in many countries people who are getting married much later. Single-person households are the fastest growing profile in the period we're going to see over the next 10 or 15 years around the world. And again, that changes perhaps a number of things about how we might be wanting to communicate, how we want to understand how people are living their lives, how much disposable income are people going to have in the future. And we can be optimistic about that. Certainly, in many cases, it's not the case that societies are breaking down, perhaps as family structures have come under, if you like, pressure or change. In most rich countries, crime is falling. Not the case in lower income countries, however. Drug possession, drug trafficking, vehicle theft, still on the rise. All of these crimes still on the rise in less affluent countries. But in some of the higher income countries, for example, what you might call traditional crime is falling. But new crime is coming. Crime related to the internet, to fraud, to the dark web. And are we prepared? Those of us in public service, are our police services prepared for that? Are law enforcement agencies referred to that? Subject of another conference, perhaps. But this question about how society is changing is something you can see in something like crime figures that you see around the world. Cultural convergence, or increasing extremes. We have a pluralistic world. Look at languages. We have a whole series of languages spoken around the world. Chinese, Mandarin, Cantonese being the most. And yet we have convergence. You're kind enough, many of you, to listen to me speaking in English. It's almost like the new Latin of business. Around the world, it's become the language that is being used for business. And what do you think personally? Is that a good thing? Is it not? It may give you opportunities to communicate with more people around the world. But you may also feel there's something lost there. Certainly, actually, even English speakers, certainly many people in Britain worry about our loss of not being able to speak pretty much any other foreign language anymore. It's not a new thing. If you look at movies, or the films, as we call them in Britain, the top 10 films in 1975, grossing films, were also all in English. So it's not that English has suddenly taken over, but I think in the business world, as we become more global, it certainly is there, and you may not think it's all for the good. Religion. Is religion all for the good? Most people around the world identify with a religion. Most people around the world feel that we have more things in common than things that make us different. In Turkey, that goes up to 81%. Yet at the same time, we worry that we live in an increasingly dangerous world. And again, in Turkey, you're even more worried than, if you like, the global average. Globally, 56% agree that there are too many immigrants in their country. Too many immigrants in every country in the world. But populations are on the move. In Turkey, it's even higher than that global average. So we almost have something out of equilibrium. People are the same, but we worry about too many immigrants. The world should be a better place. There's more that bonds us than should take us apart, but it's becoming more dangerous. The workplace. I don't know if it's becoming more dangerous, but there are some challenges and some adaptations that we're all having to make there. Some of them perhaps for the good, some of them perhaps not. I feel under a lot of pressure to make money. Many of us feel that, around half of us around the world, a little bit higher in Turkey. But when we're asked, we may not do this in practice, but when we're asked, we think it's better that we had a good work-life balance. And then we go back to work. But the idea that we, I think, as global citizens is increasingly we'd like to be able to balance our working life a little bit rather than work 12 or 15 hours a day. More people are working remotely, more opportunity perhaps coming from some of that. People are starting to work fewer hours. People are starting to be clearer about wanting to work for an organisation that, if you like, is about more than simply making money. The President of Corporate Affairs from Nestlé, for example, refers back to a time when businesses absolutely had a social purpose, but perhaps to a time when that was lost, and to a time, this time, where perhaps rediscovering that social purpose is going to be important. And we see that in many of the world's biggest brands around the world. If you take Unilever, it is doing so much work, if you like, to express what it's about, the importance of sustainability, and that it's on a journey which is about more, if you like, than simply delivering to the shareholders. But perhaps, in any case, we may be searching for a better work-life balance. Maybe we're going to have more free time on our hands than we expect. Robots. Certainly it's the case that for the last 200 years, people have worried about their jobs being taken by machines. And sometimes they were right. Robots are perhaps what we might worry about now or see as potential liberation. Experts predict that they're going to take over 30% of our jobs by the year 2025. How long have we got until they take our jobs? And we're seeing it already. 60,000 job losses in a Chinese factory as the robots take over. And even in the good old finance department, the new bookkeeper is a robot and can do many of the basic things that finance departments do. Let's see how that changes our working life. But it certainly means perhaps jobs are going to have, many jobs anyway, a different set of objectives, different emphases, depending on the sector that we're working in. And then the final trend is this trend about public opinion as a revolutionary, transforming force. And again, coming back to my initial points, that can be good, and maybe that can bring with it some problems and some questions that really governments, organisations are struggling to even understand, let alone deal with. Around the world, we have the bulk of people dissatisfied with the way that they are governed. Now, you could see that as a good thing. We're not as deferential as we were in the past. If we don't like something, we say it, we mean it, we can express ourselves, and we don't feel worried about that. But we could also feel that that brings with it serious questions about where things are going. A book like this, the book called The Precariat, which takes a look at instabilities in society, particularly thinking about perhaps people who are the left behind, the people on the edge of society. A group which may be anxious about what it sees, anxious about changes it sees, about other vulnerable groups, perhaps even less left behind than they are. Are those people susceptible to political extremism. And we can see much of that in the political world, around the world, which really raises questions about whether our governments are really able to cope with the questions that the populations are starting to ask them. So, that's our 10 trends. They're all available for you to share and dip into, so I just hope they're useful reference points for you. Just to recap, I think the big thing that I found in putting it together is this dichotomy between positive and questions, opportunity and worry. We have these dynamic populations, but populations getting older gives so many questions about how our healthcare and how our government systems are going to be able to cope. Opportunity, but inequality, those left behind people, the people not yet online. Are we in touch with them? Are we paying enough attention to them? The mega cities. We all need to live there, but we don't necessarily want to live there. How are they going to evolve? Can they evolve in a way that is going to be, if you like, more sustainable? This point about increasing connectedness and decreasing privacy, changing our behaviour, the attention deficit, going to our phones every second, perhaps we're losing something. Are we in touch with that? Are our organisations in touch with how people are living their lives these days? Changing behaviour can be good, may not be so good, depends your point of view. Healthier. We are healthier on balance around the world, but there are new illnesses that we're having to deal with, like obesity, and our planet, let's say, perhaps might be a little bit tired, and can we put it in a better shape to deal with where we're going next? We have the rise of individual choice, good thing. The fracturing of the mass market could be a good thing as well. But are we going to enjoy the ride, whether it's with Uber or whether it's in our own organisation, perhaps not adapting quickly enough? We have the rise of the individual. Are our societies as cohesive as we would like them to be? How are crime rates around the world going to fall as countries get more affluent, or are we going to actually see ourselves plagued with new and different types of crime, which make things just as distressing as they ever were? We see cultural convergence and a coming together, a desire to come together around the world, but we'll also see more tension in so many parts of the world, but often more tensions within countries, perhaps countries that are not at ease with themselves. And that's something really to watch out for. That point about inequality within countries growing. It's a big issue, for example, for China, where the top 1% of the population own something like a third of the wealth. Always, always on. We're always at work. We're always keeping in touch with our emails. Can we really find a better work-life balance? And what, again, does that mean? What opportunities come from that? And to finish, that point about public opinion. I could do you a presentation about how liberating it is that people are able to express themselves in so many different ways. This is a world that is transformed from the times of our grandparents. But equally, as you well know, it brings with it new questions about whether our governments are adapting quickly enough to the expectations that all those different diverse groups have, and that the dynamicness of the population movements, population expectations, where are we heading here, and are our governments able to cope? So in pulling together the presentation, as I mentioned, it depends. If you're a naturally shiny, happy person, you can do a presentation which shows how fantastic the world is, the amazing changes that are happening, transforming our lives. Governments are adapting reasonably well to the new environment. Companies are providing new products, new opportunities, new services, new challenges. Isn't it great? Or I could do a very depressed presentation all around, actually, poverty still here, still people without drinking water. Even if I go to the more affluent populations, people who aren't online, we have questions about whether our healthcare systems are able to cope. We have questions about whether we can cope with all of the different pressures. We have questions about whether our governments can cope. So I could give you a happy presentation. I could give you a sad presentation. I hope I've got the balance right today in just trying to raise some of those questions, perhaps some of that dichotomy in the world, which perhaps makes it such a fascinating place, For those of us who are researchers or marketing people or advertisers, a place where we just have to be on our toes. And if we can understand it better, I hope that we can all do a better job at whatever it is that we're doing. And I hope we can also perhaps reflect on our own lives and perhaps be a little bit happier too, just in relaxing at times and just thinking through, yeah, no, there are some good things that go alongside those pressures and those annoying things that I have to experience in my life. So I hope I've got the balance right, and I hope this has been a useful overview just of some of the trends around the world packaged in a single 10-point agenda. Thank you for having me.